In today's podcast, I am pleased to be joined by both Abbie McGregor and Andrew Woodman of the newly formed Gamblers Consumers Forum. Welcome to you both. I think the best place to start off today is with an introduction to the Gamblers Consumers Forum and what it has been set up to do.
Well, thank you so much for having us. So the Gambling Consumers Forum is a group that represents and defends both the interests of healthy recreational bettors, but also seeks a better outcome for addicts than the white paper will afford them. So this is essentially what sets us apart from the punters panel and the horse races betting forum. We argue that the government have got it badly wrong in understanding the nature of addiction. So the white paper that will likely see an increase in black market activity and may damage multi-million-pound tax revenue generating industries like the horse racing industry will all be for nothing, because the regulation within it, we believe, will not help the addicts that it purports to protect. We need a white paper that accepts how addiction operates, and then we need to have a conversation based on sound scientific evidence, not something rooted in ideology. When we do that, we will then realise that the vast majority of people who gamble can and should be able to do so risk and regulation free. And we therefore believe that affordability checks should be strongly argued against, because this is the main weapon being used against gamblers.
Okay, great. Well, there's a lot there to unpack. And I think many people listening from a punting perspective will be very happy to hear a lot of what you're talking about there. So tell me a little bit about who's involved with the Gamblers Consumers Forum, because the fear for some of the other organisations is that they are run or, they are in some way connected to bookmakers or those companies with bookmakers' interest for their, the BHA or the punters panel, for example. Tell me a little bit about who's involved.
So we pride ourselves on the fact that we are an independent group made up of ordinary people who love to gamble. So I come from a background of running political campaigns. I'm also a PhD student in neuroscience, so I have an appreciation for research and how science should be done properly. I think that a big part of the problem, which I'm sure we'll go into later, is the academic side of the anti-gambling narrative. And in order to make a difference, we can't just preach to the converted. We urgently need to change the anti-gambling narrative being channeled in our media. And we need a group who is prepared to hold those who speak with such ignorant authority on gambling to account. And so Andrew is obviously a keen gambler himself, well connected in the political arena. But fundamentally, we feel that the conversation has been between the anti-gambling lobby and the big court bookmakers. And of course, there are a bunch of people in the middle, us, who need to have a voice and need their interests defended.
Yes, more than just a bunch. The vast majority of people who do so, who involved in betting, haven't up till now been represented. And so your organisation is there to start to represent them. Obviously, independent is great, but how are you going to be funded? Because that's obviously the question that many people will have.
Well, we are in the process of setting up a website, and we will rely entirely on donations from like-minded individuals who want to protect the right as adults to gamble and want to protect the industries that gambling supports. And we hope that will encompass a wide range of people, because part of why we exist is that we will defend the interests of the professional gambler, the regular recreational gambler, and also the gambler who maybe just places a bet on Grand National Day. We really are for everybody, because I think whether you are a very keen gambler or not, everyone should be very concerned that the government think it's their role to self-regulate on your behalf. So I think that part of our message is we want to help those that just want to exercise their perfectly legal right to place a bet. But in the bigger picture, we also want to send the message to the government that people don't really like being told what to do, how to spend their money, whether they are a problem gambler or not. That's not for the government to decide. The government aren't doctors, and they are positioning themselves as though they are. That's really who we're seeking to represent and who we hope will support us.
Mm-hmm. And obviously with your scientific background, and we'll start to explore that, you will have the qualifications to be speaking with authority and with experience about these topics. So Andrew, let's bring you in here, because I think an important part of this, and from what Abbie says, you've got experience in politics, but you have experience and connections in Westminster, and we read about the lobbying that goes on from bookmakers. We've read about certain politicians getting caught in terms of the benefits they have received from bookmakers. How important is it for the Gamblers Consumers Forum and yourself and Abbie to be, centrally involved in Westminster and be able to talk to the people that are influential?
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously, having worked in Westminster for the last 13 years, I've been in meetings where we have been lobbied on various topics, but with the person I used to work for expressing an interest, possibly down to my interest as well, in sort of the legislation around gambling, we were lobbied by a number of people in the industry. And I think there's been a problem with the lobbying in gambling, with sort of the benefits which have been taken by some MPs, which have not really helped the argument in favour of the bookmakers. It's certainly been used by the anti-gambling lobby. What we will be seeking to do is to lobby just based on our arguments. We're not going to be issuing freebies to race days or that sort of thing. We believe we've got good scientific arguments which represent MPs' constituents.
So you're not going to be offering free tickets to Stoke-on-Trent, to Stoke City games, sorry.
That's not part of our offer, I'm afraid. Our offer will be based on pure facts and science.
Obviously, being in politics, it gives you a lot of experience in terms of dealing with a diverse group, people that fall out with each other. You can certainly see it especially on gambling Twitter or people in the betting world. Sometimes it's hard to see how there's no unity, there's extremes on all sides. I guess the political experience that you have will help you unite, if you like, as best you can, some of those factions.
Yes, as it happens, I'm part of. I'm still a councillor, so I'm part of an alliance at the moment of different parties. So I have friends and contacts in all separate parties. In fact, I find very often that I agree with some people in other parties a lot more than I agree with people in my own party. And I would hope that all parties will be receptive to the facts and the science that we're putting forward.
Let's unpack some of the issues and the things that you're campaigning on. The white paper is the big central topic at the moment. That's a white paper that outlines what the government would like to do. It took forever to come out. It's still got a whole bunch of consultations that need to take place. No one can seemingly make a decision. Can you outline, if you like, the main proposals from that white paper and the issues that you have with them?
Fundamentally, the Gambling Consumers Forum believe that the issue of addiction under this anti-gambling narrative has become a social issue rather than what it is, which is a clinical one. And the reality is the best way the government can help those addicted is actually to do very little. Leave it to the professionals with specialisation in addiction recovery. We have so many academics who are prominent gambling researchers, like Dr. Heather Wardle, for example, who's a sociologist. And I had an excellent conversation with Dr. Robert Lefevre, who I'll expand upon a bit later, but he's an addict himself and he's a pioneering addiction specialist. These are the people that we should have at the helm. Addiction is a cognitive condition. It's not one that you can catch by being in a casino. And because of this philosophy that is fundamentally flawed, that's how we have come up with a white paper that does not address the problem of addiction at all. So you have affordability checks. Now, this 125 affordability check sort of reminds me of the COVID rule of 6. Now, whether you agree with COVID lockdowns or not, or you thought the regulations were too much or too little, what was their scientific basis? That's really the important question. So why was it the rule of 6? Why was it not 4? Why was it not 8? So that's the question we have to ask about all the aspects of the white paper. Where is the scientific basis for this? There's been little transparency as to what credit reference agencies will be looking for when these affordability assessments are undertaken, including whether any past CCJs will be taken into account. So then you have a big fundamental concern that a simple process of placing a bet will turn into something that resembles a mortgage application. Credit agencies are a really outdated method to use anyway. because they're unable to match a person's income and assets with their expenditure. And so you can't really generate a reliable and accurate financial assessment of somebody. But more importantly, credit checks are used to check against someone's ability to safely use someone else's money, not their own. If you undergo a credit check, it's because you're spending someone else's money and they want assurances that it will be spent safely, not for your own money. And so while some in the anti-gambling lobby will see a reduction of betting turnover as a success as a result of affordability checks, the result is the black market. And it's as simple as that. You will see an increase in the black market because the government seem to believe that if you remove gambling and pretend that it doesn't exist for those that are addicted, people will stop. That's not how addiction works, because if that was the case, there'd be no such thing as addiction. If it was simply the case that you had to remove the addictive agent, then we wouldn't even need to be having this conversation. Then you've got minimum stakes on slots. So just as a personal anecdote, when I was 24 years old, I owned my own house and I had 3 children. Yet under these current proposals, I would not be able to place more than £2.50 on a slot. And the government are therefore setting a very dangerous precedent here, because what they're proposing is to self-regulate on your behalf. Now, when you're 18 to 24, you have an increased risk-reward system in your brain that makes you engage in more risky behaviour than your adult counterparts. And this is normal. That is how your brain learns to self-regulate. The brain can only develop properly when you activate it. If you don't activate the parts of the brain responsible for self-regulation, you will have that deficiency as an adult. Your speech is a good example of this. We have an innate ability to speak, but we need to be spoken to in order for normal speech to develop. The government are proposing to self-regulate on your behalf. And that is a completely unnecessary thing to do. Gambling, the desire to gamble, the want to gamble, is a perfectly normal and natural human behaviour. We do it all the time. How many times do you say, I bet you a fiver it will rain tomorrow? It's a normal evolutionary desire to want to predict the outcome of something. And the government are pretending that it's something we need to be protected against. And then you've got, of course, probably what I find most concerning is the discussion about children. Children are clearly being weaponised here as a way to punish adults for what a lot of MPs see as the immoral activity of gambling, because it really shows the depth of the anti-gambling sentiment some MPs hold. For them, it's not enough that children simply do not gamble, and I think we can all agree that children shouldn't be gambling, but they want to make it as though gambling does not exist until you reach your 18th birthday. So it's not enough that you don't participate in gambling. You shouldn't be able to ever see a gambling advert ever. And this once again shows that the government believe addiction is something that happens to you, something that can be acquired or caught, rather than something that's within you. But that doesn't explain why some of us become addicted and some do not, because therefore, the more time you spend in a casino or on the betting ring of the horse racing, surely you should then become addicted. But that's obviously not true. So addiction must work in a different way other than just simply exposure. And apart from the wrong clinical approach to that, it's also completely impractical. One of the bedrocks of legislation is that it should be implementable. So the white paper proposes that no under 18s or vulnerable people should view gambling advertising online. So under 18s, that's fairly simple to do. But how on earth do you program an algorithm for a vulnerable person? What is a vulnerable person? Is there any scientific evidence to suggest that it's possible to become halfway addicted or nearly addicted? Because surely that's what a vulnerable person means, someone who's on the cusp of addiction. But there really is no evidence to suggest that that's possible, that you can sort of be addicted and sort of not. Because if there isn't, then the whole approach needs to change. It's addicts versus everybody else. And that's not a disparaging accusation. It's much the same as we recognise that children with dyslexia are different. In both cases, there has to be an acceptance that those who are dyslexic and those who are not have fundamentally different needs. And it's the same with addicts. Addicts have different needs to everybody else, and they need to be separated out. We cannot create a population of patients. The addicts need their specific care, as with every other addiction, and everybody else needs nothing.
The current outline, the narrative, obviously, is that gambling is bad and it's a dirty word, if you like. And therefore, it makes sense from perhaps the politicians and those to think, well, let's apply these restrictions and apply these limitations, and that will resolve the problem. Clearly, from the evidence, the information I've seen, what you're telling me, that doesn't seem to be the reality. But what would you do in terms of addiction then, presuming that somebody that's vulnerable to that? What would be the optimal approach to then tackle them rather than just the current proposals?
The real problem that addicts face is, ironically, the anti-gambling lobby themselves, because even they feel that the recent white paper proposals don't go far enough. Ian Duncan Smith stood up in Parliament and said it's a good start. So what you have is an anti-gambling lobby who believe that we need more regulation. The best way to help addicts is for the government to do very little. Leave it to the professionals. So I mentioned before Dr. Robert Lefevre. He joined me on another podcast to discuss the white paper. Now, he opened the first addiction rehabilitation clinic in the UK. He is vastly successful at what he does. He absolutely understands his craft. And he estimates that 1 in 6 of the population has an addictive nature. And that's alcohol, gambling, sex, substance abuse, food, shopping. My husband will probably argue I have a shopping addiction. Contrastively, 5 out of 6 of the population have no issue across the board with regards to addiction whatsoever. And that 1 in 6 statistic, which encompasses all addictions and not just gambling, you might say that could be considered somewhat low, I would have thought, given the mass availability of these addictive agents. So why aren't more of us addicted, given that any adult can go into an off license and buy 6 cases of beer, have as much sex as they like, consume as much chocolate as they like? Why is it that some of us take 1 puff of that cigarette behind the bike shed at school and never smoke again, and then some of us go on to be lifelong chain smokers? Clearly there's a difference between that 1 out of 6 and the rest of society. And as different neuroimaging techniques advance, it's becoming clearer than ever that many mental disorders and defects are actually genetically predetermined. So depression and addiction, for example, are both linked to genetic defects in key neurotransmitters. So serotonin for depression and dopamine for addiction. And this is actually in line with David Goodman's research. He researches alcoholics, and he found that behavioural disorders are most strongly correlated to genetic dispositions. And so this is where the government have got it wrong, because the white paper is predicated on the assumption that everyone is one better way from addiction, and therefore everyone needs restrictions as a protective barrier. Addicts need to realise that they are unable to gamble or consume alcohol or smoke safely. Their hardwiring in their brains doesn't allow them to do that as everybody else. So therefore, they need help. They need to be put on a rehabilitation program to learn to enjoy their lives with their deficiencies in mind. It's an acceptance. But the government has to accept that not everybody is like that. People are able to gamble safely, and they have to realise that the process that an addict goes through when they place a bet and the process that healthy bettor goes through when they place a bet are vastly different. So if I were to place a bet as a healthy recreational bettor who's been gambling for many years and regularly bets, when I win, my brain is flooded with dopamine. But my brain says, right, this is great. We love dopamine. It's our pleasure hormone, but we need to get it out of here, because if I'm in a dopamine high for too long, I might do something that would threaten my survivability. It's all about evolution. So I might say, oh, I'm going to go and buy a Ferrari or something mad like that. So my brain gets rid of the dopamine and it returns to homeostasis, which is the body's normal operating conditions. But in addicts, there's research that up to 40% of people are unable to clear that dopamine efficiently, which means that they take a sustained dopamine hit, which means that they need more dopamine next time, and they're more likely to engage in riskier behavior. So as you can see, this is not a social issue. This is not something that is a result of spending a lot of time in a casino. This is to do with your hardwiring. And there's no better evidence for that than up to 40% of people who are addicted to gambling also have other addictions. Now, I have a suspicion that is more, because obviously this is all self-reporting. A lot of people don't report their addictions. They can't recognize them. So that is a great demonstration of the fact that it's not just gambling. The term problem gambler is born out of intellectual dishonesty because it intrinsically ties the problem to gambling. There's no clinical diagnosis called a problem gambler. You are not diagnosed at the GP as being a problem gambler. You are diagnosed as being an addict. The reason why the anti-gambling lobby use the word problem gambler is because it intrinsically ties the problem to gambling. The problem lies with the individual. And again, that's not a disparaging thing. That's just an acceptance of reality. If they're not addicted to gambling, it's likely they're also addicted to something else.
How many specialist treatment centres are there for gambling addiction, if you like, in the UK?
I don't have these specific numbers.
But that's what would need to be funded. That's the solution in many ways, professional expertise.
That is absolutely the way forward, because you have to look at, again, this is part of the problem, is that we are not looking at addiction as a whole. We are looking at problem gambling. You don't have problem heroin users, do you? You don't have problem alcohol users. You have alcoholics. So we need to look at addiction as a whole.
So what they're proposing as a solution, which are these affordability checks, deposit checks, isn't going to resolve the problem. It's just going to send it somewhere else. And then obviously the black market,
absolutely,
which isn't regulated. And now, Andrew, I don't know if you have any expertise on this as well, but is there evidence of the black market growth? I suspect that you both believe that what is being proposed in the white paper will just lead to growth of the black market.
Yeah, I think the issue is that officials in DCMS don't particularly want to go looking for it. I was in a meeting where the black market was brought up with them, and what could they do to combat it? And the idea was to talk about putting it lower down the Google rankings. I don't think they've got any idea of how prevalent it is. And it's common sense. It's easier than ever. There's WhatsApp bookies springing up all over the place. They're operating in all areas of the world. We all know this, but it's a bit like tobacco, to be honest, where I recall a Labour MP asking a question about tobacco smuggling and the amount they lost in the black market. And I don't think the minister particularly wanted to know, because I don't think they want to go looking. So we all know that there's a black market, but I don't think DCMS want to find it.
Well, one of the things from the white paper is that they intended to beef up the powers of the Gambling Commission, what we'll talk about as well, to clamp down on the black market. That to me seemed incredibly naive. That black market restriction doesn't work in China, in India, in places where the black market thrives, where gambling is illegal. That just seems completely mad, doesn't it?
Well, the Gambling Commission are like a kite in a hurricane when it comes to the black market. You've got an organisation there which doesn't have anyone with any particular expertise in gambling. In fact, if you have any expertise in gambling, then you're swiftly shown the door on the application stage, as far as I can see, certainly looking at the public appointments that they've made. So they won't even know where to begin to look.
Yes, well, according to a survey conducted by YouGov on behalf of the Betting and Gaming Council, 79% of bettors believed that affordability checks and regulations would result in more people going to the black market. And it turns out they were right, because black market gambling sites visits trebled during the World Cup. Now, that is an absolutely staggering figure, because the Gambling Consumers Forum have three concerns on this, chiefly. Is that the black market thrives on vulnerability. So we're trying to stop vulnerable people from being harmed. And we are now sending them to an unregulated market where vulnerable people can be exploited off the radar. At the moment, we can see where the addicts are. But as soon as they go into the black market, they become invisible to us. And they can then be exploited much more easily by, let's face it, criminals. So how easy do you think it is in this day and age to go onto a website and pay a con man £50 to generate a fake bank statement? Now, 30 years ago, wouldn't have happened. But now, you can get a really sophisticated looking bank statement. I've personally tried it myself. I really couldn't tell the difference. But I still paid someone £75 to produce one for me. Now, of course, it does say that you're not supposed to use it for fraudulent purposes. Has to say that as a disclaimer. But of course, people will. And so it's again, the government thinking that they have more powers and influence than they actually do. The government can't even stop people from using Class A drugs. Why on earth does it think that it can stop people from going onto very bad sites on the internet? It thinks it has more capabilities than it does. And again, it doesn't do anything to solve the problem of gambling addiction. It just disguises it. You can see that in I'm glad Andrew brought it up, the tobacco and smoking industry. So smoking rates are falling in every developed country in the world. They're falling in England, where commercial freedoms on cigarette advertising are severely restricted, and they're falling in Germany, where you can advertise cigarettes on a billboard. So ASH, which is the anti-smoking lobby in the UK, they credit the lack of advertising with the fall in smoking rates, which of course is completely bonkers because, as I literally just said, it's okay in Germany to advertise and their smoking rates are still falling. It's a complete myth that the only thing that motivates people's behaviour is advertising, as though people have no free will. They're just at the hopeless mercy of advertising and marketing. But the thing is that smoking rates may have fallen. That may be true. But what's actually going up is nicotine use. So, okay, you've stopped people smoking. You've taken away a medium that they use, but ultimately you've done nothing to resolve the addictive agent, which is the nicotine, which is still objectively harmful to you. So all you've done is you've just disguised the problem. Everyone in the anti-smoking lobby are patting themselves on the back for a job well done, yet all you've done is transferred people from one medium to another. And again, it's the fundamental misunderstanding of addiction. Oh, I can't use a cigarette. Oh, okay, no problem. I guess I'll just stop my smoking addiction. No, of course not. They'll go and find something else.
Yeah, so the problem doesn't go away, it just goes somewhere else. And then if it goes to the black market or goes in terms of criminals, then that's a different problem. And no doubt there'd be a white paper on that or some tackling of that in the future when they realise the mistake they've made. So that's obviously addiction. That's fascinating. But then let's also talk about affordability and the affordability checks, because what has been proposed in the white paper, if those not familiar, there will be limits of £1,000 loss in one day or £2,000 over 90 days. And there are lower triggers for those aged 18 to 24 that you mentioned. Now, I understand that's something that you fundamentally disagree with. But the other query as well is the people in charge of this would be bookmakers. And it strikes me as odd that we're giving those companies who have created this problem by their targeting of, how they profile customers and their targeting of vulnerable players, to giving them the tools to potentially provide the solution to it. Now, that just doesn't seem at all right, does it?
No, I mean, it's say four things about these affordability checks. They're unnecessary, unworkable, impractical, and ineffective. And, letting the foxes into the hen house with having the bookmakers control it is absolute madness. I mean, they've been obviously trying to trial the SCV, and there's not been that much coverage about the results from that. But what we're really talking about is the big corp behaviour. A lot of the bookmakers you'd probably see on Oddschecker, who have the various brands all owned under the same umbrella. And they're trying to make out that these will, having these checks, it will only be to find the problem gamblers, and they won't use it for commercial gain. And, we keep coming back to the fact that bookies can spot a winner within 3 or 4 bets, but they seemingly can't spot a problem gambler without having to have affordability checks, an SCV, and various other mediums. It doesn't make any sense.
No. It says in the white paper that mandatory data sharing by operators for high-risk online customers. But then we haven't talked about the Gambling Commission, but they are the regulator, and they are so weak as they are, you realistically can't see that not being abused, because even if it's not to identify winners, but to identify maybe losers that are losing within the realms of what is acceptable, would be appealing to customers to understand and profile and to target. So yes, it just seems unworkable. And they also talk about frictionless checks. Is that actually something that the technology is there for? I know in Ireland they're not implementing it, and one of the reasons is the technology isn't, or it also contravenes GDPR.
Yeah, and I don't understand what you're going to find with a frictionless credit check. It's not telling you what the circumstances of the individual is and what they can afford to spend. I mean, £2,000 to a single person earning £100,000 a year is probably what they would consider pocket money. £2,000 to someone earning £100,000 a year who has 4 kids at private school, who has various leases and is paying a whacking great mortgage, is probably unaffordable. What is it telling you? What are they hoping to find from these affordability checks? And that's not to say there's about 200. We estimate there's about 200,000 people who have CCJs in this country. Now they last for about 7 years, around that sort of time. Are they going to be barred from spending more than £2,000 or having to spend 7 years having to prove that they've got the wherewithal to place a bet? The detail is so scant about how this can actually work and what it's looking to achieve. It feels like we need to do something. This is something. Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, for as I understand it, the CCJs, unintrusive checks, it's called, which is a CCJ search, and that is £125 in 24 hours or £500 within a year. So, is it 200,000? You said that's quite a lot of people who are going to trigger that on a regular basis. And as someone pointed out on Twitter recently, why do we need bookmakers to oversee it when the money is coming from banks? And surely, if anyone's in a position to work out affordability, it would be a bank because they see everything and they have the training.
This just shows the kind of ludicrous of this. I mean, I think it was back in March. I own a racehorse in a small syndicate with some friends, and I pay around £3,000 for my share every year. So I went on to Ladbrokes to place a bet on my horse. She's only a young filly, so I didn't want to go too big. So I did £50 each way. And Ladbrokes would not allow me to place that bet without providing a bank statement. And so I was able to place a bet on a horse that I have £3,000 worth of shares in. No one asked me if I could afford that. No one asked me where the money came from. They just took it. I was able to place an each way bet of 3p. Ludicrous.
And so this not just applies to or horse syndicate ownership. It could be applying to stocks and shares. It could apply to crypto. There are so many other ways you can spend your money which don't have these.
Forget about the stock market, which I absolutely agree with you. Anytime you invest in shares, that is a bet. You can place a 10,000 bet on shares tomorrow, but no one asks you where the money comes from. Mm-hmm. But you can spend £2 a day on a cup of coffee on the way to work, and no one comes up and says to you on the 15th of the month, oh, hang on a minute, you've been coming in here every day, getting a cup of coffee every day. Are you sure that you can afford to continue this? Could we see evidence of your income, please? I mean, it's ludicrous. It's the idea the government have that people need help spending their money. Clearly they do not.
There's also a class argument here with the idea that people who go to betting shops or whichever ways they choose to gamble are somehow seen as degenerates in the eyes of certain lawmakers who don't really come from the sort of class where they meet your general working class better. These sort of people need to be protected, but obviously if you're going to go trading on derivatives or a stock market or anything else that they'd see as that's middle to upper class sort of, they're respectable people like the bankers in 2008. They can be trusted. They're not a problem. We don't need to interfere in their lives, but the hoi polloi who don't understand how to manage their own money, we need to get involved in their lives.
That's very true, because they can't relate to it. And perhaps it's an easy vote winner as well. It's probably when politicians think about, you'll probably know, Andrew, especially about what's going to get them elected, saying that you're in favour of betting might not be the best, or you like betting, or it's, it can be an enjoyable pastime. Is perhaps the biggest vote winner. So obviously we talked about affordability checks and you're concerned with them, the issues with the way that addiction is being focused on and tackled here. But let's also talk about your issues with regulation, because I imagine that's something else that's on your agenda. And one of the winners, if you like, from the white paper was the Gambling Commission, who seemed to be being attributed with more powers and funding. What do you think about this? Do they deserve it? And in terms of their role up to now and how you'd like to see it different in the future?
Well, I think, as I've already mentioned, the Gambling Commission is an overtly anti-gambling organisation. It doesn't employ people who have any knowledge about gambling.
Yeah.
They act as if gambling needs to be reduced. A lot of regulators would consider that they have to support their industry and help the consumers who are using that industry if the operators are abusing their power. But the Gambling Commission seems to have taken on a life of its own with the way it wants to regulate the industry.
And that's why you've got the problem with the statutory levy. And coming back to Andrew's point about class, you saw a lot of this in the American banking industry before the 2008 housing crash, is they filled documents with obscure sounding terms to make people think that only they know what they were talking about. Just leave the big boys alone to do their jobs. The statutory levy is simply a research fund. Why not call it that? It's a research fund, but it's a fundamentally bad and disingenuous research fund because MPs have already made it clear that they want the gambling industry to have no access to this levy. So when you remove the industry, what are you left with? You're left with people who are against the industry. And my cynicism tells me that this levy will become a lefty academic slush fund for yet more anti-gambling data, most of which is based on bad science. Because the anti-gambling zealots can't even decide amongst themselves what the rate of gambling addiction is. So the Gambling Commission say it's 0.2, Gamble Aware say it's 2.7. And so this is where you get the problem with the big numbers game that they play. So if the rate of gambling addiction is based on the rate of suicides, how can you not, if that's the main premise of your argument, how can you not know what the rate of suicide is and what the rate of addiction is? It's all a science that's been massaged to privilege the hypothesis, the narrative, the ideology. These consultations, they aren't actually consultations, they're more like confirmations. And the Gambling Commission are driving this. They are categorizing their research into people that are pro-gambling and people that are anti-gambling. So as Andrew has already mentioned, if you want to apply for a research grant from the Gambling Commission Suicide Research Project to undertake research, you cannot have received support or undertaken any work with the gambling industry in the previous 5 years. And your research must include those who have with lived experience of gambling harm. Now, as a researcher myself, for me, research is research. Experience in gambling research in whatever form should not preclude you from researching it further. There should be no pro or anti-gambling researchers. There should just be researchers. That's bad science to put categories on kind of your social beliefs. You don't have social beliefs in science. You just have the evidence that's in front of you.
Yes, that's something I noted. There is a whole section of academia who get some very generous grants from the Gambling Commission as well. And there seems to be this narrative that the Gambling Commission is, very much anti-gambling, as you say, Andrew, whereby they are made up of people who either don't have any experience of the gambling industry or perhaps seemingly anti the gambling world themselves. Have you been able to make any inroads with the Gambling Commission, or do you hope to, and their representatives in terms of your work at the Gamblers Consumers Forum?
Well, I've been in on meetings with top level officials at the Gambling Commission, particularly around the single customer view, and they sort of look like they're taking on board your points, but once they've made their minds up on the path they want to go down, it's very difficult to get them to change their mind. We will try and to fully engage with the Gambling Commission with the facts and the science that we have. We'll have to see what response we get back from them.
We don't hold out much hope.
But we can harass them every day for a response, so we will get something back.
What would you like to see in an ideal world? What would GCF like to see from a regulation perspective?
I think we need a new regulator with new management and a new culture. A regulator which, as I said before, it actually supports the industry. It regulates, as it should do according to the regulator's charter, and also protects the consumers against bad practice which the Gambling Commission isn't even doing. I mean, the Gambling Commission, I mean, let's take affordability. I mean, it sets rules to operators. Operators, to be fair to them, don't know how to interpret it. And so they go too far and they're asking for information on withdrawals and that sort of thing, which we know they shouldn't be doing. But a lot of them are asking for pay slips up front and that sort of thing. And then the Gambling Commission deny that they've ever mandated affordability.
I know.
They're leaving operators not knowing what to do. They're leaving consumers having to send in every document regarding their financial history to get £2.50 each way on a £2.50 at Chepstow. So they're failing everybody.
And they're also failing the industries as well that rely on gambling. I'm obviously a massive horse racing fan, so I might be a bit biased, but horse racing is a part of our national heritage. The Grand National is watched by, I think it's 500 million people worldwide. People do office sweepstakes around the Grand National. The Derby is one of the oldest horse races in the world. Royal Ascot, the King comes to watch his horse run. Cheltenham is the Olympics of jump racing. And these industries, not only are they a fantastic pastime for people and part of the fabric of what it means to be British, I think the breeding industry for horse racing supports something like 80,000 jobs. So for me, it's beyond my comprehension that the Conservatives are not encouraging this industry to thrive, because most of this is all done in the north. It's the ultimate northern powerhouse. It's the ultimate British grown industry. We need a regulator that is going to support and make sure that industries like horse racing are properly funded. 33% of prize money in horse racing comes from betting turnover. And so if horse racing is on the decline, so are the local economies that the racetracks support and the jobs. So the implications are really quite far reaching. And that's not being discussed, because in the white paper, you would have to go through it with a fine-tooth comb to find the benefits of gambling.
Yeah.
Not just to individuals, but the country as a whole, and the economy, the tax revenue that it generates. We need somebody who is willing to stand up for our hobby. And it does work. It does. So anyone who's been paying attention to what happened at the Grand National and the Derby with Animal Rising, they posed a massive threat, not just on the day in terms of security, but in terms of how the public perceived horse racing. And people from the Jockey Club, they went on a national media campaign and they picked apart the inconsistencies in their arguments, and they called them up for their end goal, which is ultimately to ban horse racing and to see the elimination of the thoroughbred as a breed. That is what we need to do. We need to go on a media campaign. That is what we will do. We need to go on a media campaign to change the addiction narrative, but also the anti-gambling narrative, and call out these people for what they are, which is prohibitionists who want to see the end of gambling. They want to stand up and tell you what they think is right for you to do, what they think is harmful to you. And I think that if people realise that was their end goal, not many people would like it. Because I certainly, as an adult, don't want to be told what to do. And I find it rather insulting that the government thinks that I'm incapable of managing my own finances.
That's all really good points. And like I say, this is more than just some punters complaining that they can't get their bets on, or they have to send bank statements. And the knock-on effect is huge, whether it be those people struggling with addiction, whether it be the industries that are supported by the betting world. And for desire for an improved look, a scientific-based look at some of these issues and real-world solutions to it. So I'm all in favour of what you're doing. And the one other question I was going to ask actually is about ombudsman, because that's the other area where there is a failure, it seems, at the moment in the industry, because the Gambling Commission don't take any responsibility. They set the rules, but they don't seem to enforce them particularly strongly or at all when it comes to issues that then go to the ombudsman. But the ombudsman is, in many ways, is indirectly or slightly directly funded by bookmakers, because the number of cases that they take depends upon their funding. And a new ombudsman has been proposed in the white paper. What can you tell me about that and your own take on what you'd like to see happen?
I mean, I think an ombudsman depending on its remit, would be a good thing. If the Ombudsman was there to rule on unfair practices by bookmakers, what the risk is, and we've seen this with one or two cases, is that some punters who have lost a lot of money decide to go down the ambulance chasing route and try to sue the bookmakers for taking their bets. So in principle, we can see the advantages, but as with everything, the devil is in the detail, and we wouldn't want to see an ombudsman being used by the anti-gambling lobby to sort of further their ends.
We've covered a lot of ground on this particular podcast today, and thank you for outlining your thoughts on the current situation and the white paper and what you'd like to see change. I think one of the questions I also want to ask is, we've got a Conservative government, likely will be in charge for another 15, 16 months perhaps before an election is called. Will we see this white paper go through in its current guise? And the other question would be, what might Labour do differently if, as expected, they form the next government?
Well, I think usually I'd say the difference between a Conservative government and a Labour government ought to be a fair amount, but it seems at present all the parties are now pro nanny state regulation. But of course, Carolyn Harris wrote an article, I think it was for The Independent, where she outlined what she would like to see in the white paper. And funnily enough, that essentially became the white paper. So Labour are the drivers behind this. It's a philosophical thing where they think that there should be a big state where the government should protect you from harm at all costs, or what it defines as harm. And we've talked about a lot of the regulation being impractical. And why on earth is it? Has no one actually looked at this? Has anyone actually read this thing they've produced? That's because it's supposed to be impractical, because the first set of regulations can never be allowed to succeed, because if they do succeed, you're then closing the door on regulations and measures that go further. So the first set of regulations are always nonsensical. They can be picked apart upon the slightest scrutiny. So when they don't work, rather than going back and saying, no, we've made a mistake, this obviously doesn't work, they were saying, no, it was because we didn't go far enough. We need to go further. And that's one of the things that we need to be asking the industry leaders in the Gambling Commission, in the Betting Gaming Council, that the reform of the 2005 Gambling Act was supposed to be this major overhaul, the biggest since its creation. Now that's been done, do you think that there are any measures that need to go further? If the white paper legislation doesn't see a fall in what you define as problem gambling, will you support measures that go further? Because the ratchet only goes in one direction. It only goes forwards. It never, ever goes backwards. And I cannot see Labour taking a softer stance on gambling than is currently. Part of the problem is that you've got no real united pushback in Parliament from one party. It's not a divided issue. You've got small pockets of opposition. It's a bit like it's been in the news recently, the buy one, get one free deals. You have some MPs are opposed to it, but you've got no single party advocating for their removal as a pledge. And so therefore the supermarkets just seem to be reasonably happy to go along with it. I think the biggest hit to Labour being in power will be the smaller independent bookmakers, because Labour are not necessarily renowned for their support of small businesses and dynamic economies, particularly locally. So it might start out with online gambling. We've had assurances that this will only apply to online gambling. But what will happen if this moves into the betting ring? So all these small independent bookmakers have the compliance and IT systems to have these regulations function. If I'm betting on the races, and every time I go to a different bookmaker, because I think there should be competition, I think there should be a free market. If I want to go to different bookmakers for every race, does that mean I have to show my bank statement to every single bookmaker? Well, no, I don't want to do that. So what I'll do instead is I'll just apply for a Ladbrokes account, which they will all be for, because then that means they capture my data.
Yeah, so thank you a lot for both of you for coming on today and for explaining what you're doing at the Gambling Consumers Forum and what you stand for. What are the plans then as you get going into 2023 and 2024? Is it knocking on doors? Is it trying to arrange meetings with anyone that will listen to the points that you're trying to make?
We do plan to lobby MPs, both the current MPs, but we're also going to be looking at the candidates who are likely to make up the possibly the next Parliament. We'll be getting plenty of material out to explain the science behind our arguments. We'll be obviously commenting on topical events as this white paper progresses. We'll be responding to consultations. And we will generally just try to get across the view of the 30 million punters who just want to get a bet on.
And what we really need is the support of ordinary people like us, sitting at home. So for those who are listening and for those who have been commenting on the white paper and have thoughts on it, they will be vital to our success, because what we really want to show is, in essence, as the thing we've been talking about for the past hour, is that ordinary people like to place a bet, and that's perfectly okay. It's a perfectly normal behaviour. There are people that need help, as they are in almost every recreational activity, and they absolutely should get the help that they need and deserve, but it has to be the right help. And so we want people to hopefully come forward and help us by spreading the word. Campaigns need the numbers behind them. So we hope that, as I said, people listening will back us. And because at the end of the day, MPs don't see you as people, they see you as voters. And if they think that the public tide is turning on these nanny state restrictions, it's possible that we do still have time to undo the mess that's been made and have a better future for everyone involved in gambling.
And so how can people support you with that? Like, in practical terms, is it just helping raise awareness through, whether it be Twitter, whether it be, conversations that they're able to have, or funding? Tell people the actual practical things that they can do.
Sharing on social media obviously has a huge impact. We do have a website in the works where there'll be an opportunity for people who feel like they would like to contribute to our campaign efforts. They can, because obviously it costs money to run these campaigns. And we also hope as well that people will engage with any media appearances that we do. And we hope that we can, like you said earlier, have a united front, because there are a lot of sectional interests at play here. And we realise that, just like in any campaign, people might not necessarily agree with everything that we have to say, but we would still like people to support the basic premise, which is the white paper is deeply flawed for every sector of the gambling industry, and something does need to change. And the only way that it will change is if people are vocal about it. And so we hope that we will be the vehicle for that change.
Well, people do like to be vocal on Twitter, so I like to think that they'll be able to, they'll unite behind this, because, whether you...
Positive vocals only, please.
Positive only, yeah, absolutely. But, I think most people who bet, or especially on the Twitter side of things as I see it, will no doubt have listened to this today and will be in agreement with many of the points that you're making, whether it be about the black market or the Gambling Commission or just the affordability checks, because it is a concern for people that are interested or enjoy betting in any way, shape or form, that these issues will come along and potentially impact that. So you mentioned their website. Is that, do you have that set, the link for that, or is it still in the works?
Yes, it's the gamblersconsumersforum.com, and we'll obviously have the Twitter links, which I'm sure you'll be able to promote, Pete.
Absolutely, yes. So I'm really happy to help highlight what you're doing and get behind your campaign and help in any way I can. So thank you ever so much. I really wish you the best of luck with the Gamblers Consumers Forum. Thank you for coming on, and hopefully we'll check back in the future and see what progress we've made. Thank you very much to both of you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.